mean, it's our job to create an experience that to where you can, have an intimate dining experience with your spouse or with your party, and kind of everything just happens and things arrive that you want and that you need, and then they go away when you don't. And that's really for me the ultimate goal is to be unobtrusive, but also create a sense of true hospitality. Hospitality comes easy to me, right? I mean, for me, and that's why I say I felt like it was something that I was meant to do, because it's sort of my role in my family and amongst my friends to be the one to host the party, to make sure everyone is happy. That's sort of just in my nature. And so much of what I did, at least in the early days, was just that. And education and food is something that I'm passionate about. And the level of service, because I did have a fine dining server background, I was able to tap into that and sort of take the things that I had learned and just plant them into a management role. And I found really quickly that I was able to develop relationships with my hourly support staff to where they trusted my word, and we were able to work together as a team. So I've realized that I had some leadership skills that I hadn't otherwise needed to sort of flex because I hadn't been put in that position. But once I did, it felt very comfortable and natural. I had a friend of mine come to me and say, I know you've been trying to kind of get out of this, but the reality is that you're restaurant people and you should just jump in both feet because you're really good at it. And I think that you could do really well.
What was it like running a restaurant there in a place like that?
It was wild. It was high energy, Friday night, every night for 5 months. And it was so outrageously busy from about Memorial Day to Labor Day, and then you kind of die down, and then Christmas week hit, and then you're just going and going until, mid-March. So it was a wild time, and the most volume that I'd ever done before, but you get to learn really quickly on, for me, how to play what I call table Tetris, right? I mean, seats are their money. So every time somebody comes in, you don't say no. You cram as many people as you can in. You stretch your servers to the limit. You make sure that everybody has the tools to do their job, and you do your best to support them. And it was an amazing way for me to train myself and learn a skill set of how to manipulate reservations and tables, and to where we could maximize our occupancy every single night to where we could make the restaurant the most money. I went on to work for a celebrity chef out of New York, David Burke, and that job I had for about 3.5 years was a really big part of my MBA if we're talking about restaurants, because working with a corporate restaurant group like the Burke Group was such a learning experience for me. And I had some tremendous, people that I worked for that really believed in me and offered me an opportunity that I am I'm forever grateful for. It was such a wonderful experience. And I remember sitting at the rooftop of the Archer Hotel in downtown Manhattan, and I was talking to my boss, and we had maybe have a couple cocktails. And I said, Stephen, I want to own my own restaurant. Like I do, like I love working for you. But again, this like quiet ambition of like, there's something more, there's not enough, this is not enough, right? I'm at the peak of like corporate restaurant jobs and I'm not happy. And he just looked at me and he smiled and he goes, then go do it. You're going to be amazing. It's going to be great, right? So I left the job. I resigned, and Kat and I started our journey of trying to find an investor or a bank that would loan us the money, which we quickly learned that the only people that loan you money for a restaurant are friends, family, and fools. My style of hospitality, what I believe to be what's the most important to me is to create a culture where people are genuine and happy and gracious. And once you get to a certain threshold in a restaurant, these sort of upper echelons, you walk in and they make you feel like you're lucky to be there as opposed to the other way around. And I hate that, right? I want people to walk in and feel like we're excited that you are going to come to our restaurant and spend your hard-earned money, and we're grateful for that, and treat you with a sense of respect and graciousness and gratitude.
I'm your host, Mark Good, and this is Remarkable, a podcast focused on people and stories worthy of your attention. And now, today's show. I'd like to welcome Kristina Goodcrook to the podcast today. Kristina, you are in lovely Santa Fe, New Mexico. I have to ask because, as you've said before about me, that I live in damn near Canada. How is the weather in Santa Fe? And for those who don't know, we're recording this towards the end of May 2024.
Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on your podcast and talk a little bit about my journey, but Santa Fe is beautiful. You know, I would say the worst part about Santa Fe is the spring, funny enough, because the wind loves to blow. So it's around, it's 75 degrees, but the wind's about 40 miles an hour. So lovely in the morning for coffee, but in the afternoon, you kind of stay inside until it dies down. But that only lasts a few months.
Wow. Well, that's beautiful. Well, I asked you on the show for several reasons, but I want to start with the one that will certainly grab the attention of a lot of people, and that is that you and your wife, Kat, are co-owners of a highly rated steakhouse in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I think people would be intrigued to learn how you got there, because while many people get into those positions because maybe they go to school and, get an undergraduate degree in hospitality or something like that, that's not been your journey. So what I'd like to do is to have you take us through that. I mean, you left home, and was one of your earliest jobs being a server, or, how did you kind of get into the
Sure. So my first restaurant job was, I was a hostess at a Chili's in Dallas, Texas.
Okay.
I was 15 years old, and I tried to find anything that I could do to get out of the house. And so I quickly gravitated towards this job, and I worked as much as I could. And I remember our general manager was a woman. I can't remember her name, but I remember noticing her, and she had, this was like the early 90s. She had a giant jumble of keys on her hips. She walked faster than everybody, and she commanded the room and presence. And the family that I grew up in, I call the women in my family sort of bred to wed. I come from a long line of homemakers. And so to see a woman in a position of power and authority was something that I hadn't really witnessed before. And so I was kind of hooked, and I loved my job. It was very social, but it was also very systematic. So I started there when I was 15, and then a few years later, I began waiting tables, and I ended up at a restaurant called Houston's, which is a Hillstone Restaurant Group, and even more so found that what I loved about that company is that they're very systematic. Everything has its place. There's a way of doing things a certain way, and I love that. It was almost militant in style, but I was very drawn to that sort of structure. So I was there for a few years, and then I started working for independent chefs. And the restaurant community in Dallas is kind of tiny but mighty. There are, lots of restaurants, but most of the actual culinary community is very small, and they all support each other. And so I worked for some really amazing chefs and got the opportunity to meet some fantastic people who've helped mentor me along the way. So
before you leave that, I want to ask you about your experience at both. Was it Chili's and Houston's? Is that correct? Those are the two restaurants that you were?
They were for the first, I would say, 7 or 8 years.
Okay. So you've talked about a lot of structure and process that they have. What's interesting to me, I've eaten at both of those restaurants, whether it was the ones that you worked in or not, I don't remember. But it's interesting to me because what was visible to me as a customer was cheerful people, smiles on their faces, took our orders, served them quickly and correctly. But, all of that process and stuff that you now talk about, that's not visible to the clients at all. I mean, to the customers at all. And is that by design? Because, Gee, we don't, we just walk in and give the hostess our name and get a table, and, it just works smoothly.
Sure. Well, I think Houston's or Hillstone specifically has really dialed it to where everything is the same, right?
Mm.
If you're a server and you are going to water a table, the water comes from a certain place and your pitcher goes back into, that same area. You're walking through the kitchen, kind of streamlined through the dish area and back through the kitchen and kind of circle around. So we call it the dance, right? The dance of service. And they had it down to where every detail was so systematic. And certainly the guests didn't experience that, but there also weren't, as you're sitting down, servers going in opposite directions, kind of running into each other, frustrated because they can't find a water pitcher or where the silverware is, right? We call it mise en place, which means everything in its place. And that was sort of the beginning of my understanding of mise en place.
That's fascinating. I think for many people who go out to eat at restaurants and who, unlike yourself, are not in the business, this is all invisible. And honestly, first time I've ever really heard about it or really thought about it. It's just, it just works. And I guess that's kind of the point, is that you want it to be invisible to the customer, right? You just want them to have a great dining experience. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's our job to create an experience that to where you can, have an intimate dining experience with your spouse or with your party, and kind of everything just happens and things arrive that you want and that you need, and then they go away when you don't. And that's really, for me, the ultimate goal is to be unobtrusive, but also create a sense of true hospitality.
Listening to you describe about how things come when you need them and go away when you're done, I'd like to have that for the rest of my life.
Right.
That's pretty incredible. Okay, so that was your Dallas experience. So that was Chili's and Houston's, and then you fled North Texas to the mountains of Colorado. Is that correct or not?
So I will tell you that a big part of my journey is kind of leaning into the fact that I do feel a deep sense that this is what I'm supposed to do. I fought a lot in my 20s. I kind of grew up in a world where you are in restaurants until you do something else. And like a lot of us, we sort of land in this industry. I happened to marry a chef, right? So I actually left restaurants for a while. I went to broadcasting school to focus on, I had this desire to produce radio shows, which I did for a little bit. And in the meantime, I started waiting tables part-time, again, just to kind of have a supplemental income. And that's where I ultimately met my wife. And so she was a chef, or is a chef. And I had a friend of mine come to me and say, I know you've been trying to kind of get out of this, but the reality is that you're restaurant people and you should just jump in both feet because you're really good at it. And I think that you could do really well. So
what age were you when you were told that? How old were you when somebody told it to you?
27, or I was 28.
28. Okay. So late 20s. And I love that observation because you're absolutely correct. I mean, almost everybody who talks about the restaurant industry, yourself as an exception, of course, that it's always something, it's a job you're passing through. I was a server for a while. I was a hostess.
Yeah, I waited tables in college. I bartended through law school. Right. I know a little bit about this. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's fascinating. So late 20s, somebody says, you're restaurant people. Were you still in Dallas at that point, or had you moved?
I was still in Dallas, and I kind of chuckled and thought, oh my gosh. And I think a part of it is I hadn't leaned in enough to where I felt like I could tap into the management side. I knew that I was a really good server, and I was fortunate to work with some people who gave me opportunities at some amazing restaurants. And so I was making great money. I had amazing flexibility, but I had this voice in the back of my head that was, that quiet ambition of like, there's something more to this, and you need to really explore what that looks like, because I knew that I didn't want to be a server forever. And I say that with the understanding that most of the servers that I employ now are from ages 35 to 60, and they are career servers. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for what they do. This lifestyle allows them a lot of flexibility to make great money, but also to take some time off and have a significant amount of work-life balance. But at the time, I felt like I wanted to do more, and I didn't know where that path would lead me. And ultimately, it led me to Aspen. Kat and I had the opportunity to move there in 2010, and we worked for a husband and wife who owned several restaurants there. And she went up and did a tasting. So a chef's interview process typically includes them doing a 3-course tasting meal, right? They make some sort of an appetizer, an entree, maybe a dessert or a soup of some sort. So that way the employer can see where their skill set is and if their style is in line with their concept.
Interesting.
So she did a tasting, and I kind of had a brief interview, and they loved us and offered us a job, and we moved to Aspen 2 weeks later. And 6 months after we moved there, she was named the executive chef, and I was the general manager, having minimal management experience of their high-end steakhouse. And we did that for about 4 years.
So just so we get the antecedents right, when you say she was made the executive chef, you're referring to Kat, right?
Right.
And so the woman who hired you 6 months after the two of you were employed, and this is at the same steakhouse, is that correct?
So when we moved to Aspen, we both worked at separate restaurants,
Okay.
and I was hired as a manager, just a floor manager for another concept. And so, and after 6 months of being there, they pulled me and said, "We'd like for you to be. We're opening a new steakhouse," right? Which was the whole reason that they hired us, was to. They sort of tapped us to open this concept for them. It just hadn't been built yet. So they pulled us aside 6 months after being there, and they said, "We want her to be the executive chef and you to be the general manager to open this property."
Now, again, for people who are listening to this, and that's probably the majority of them, they don't know what either a floor manager does, a general manager in a restaurant does. And while I know the title executive chef, why don't you take us through kind of the responsibilities associated with those different roles? Because again, I think for most of us who just simply go to a restaurant and experience, as you put it, that great dining experience, or maybe not, there's a lot going on in the background. So talk a little bit about what it meant to be a floor manager, then a general manager, and then for Kat to be executive chef.
So a floor manager, their sole responsibility is to monitor service, right? So they come in and ensure that the guests are satisfied, that the servers show up, that just sort of the inner workings of service, that everything is executed in a timely manner, and they do a little bit of guest recovery.
What does guest recovery mean?
If you are unhappy with something, then a manager comes over and attempts to rectify the situation. Some people are better at it than others. It's sort of a floor manager's job to navigate through those situations and have ultimately the end result be the guests leave satisfied.
Got it. Oh, that's fascinating. And again, this is, it is a service-oriented position. So providing that quality of service is, I guess, fundamental to whether or not the person will return to that restaurant or not.
Absolutely.
So tell me, you were in your late 20s when you and Kat were invited. That would be correct. So late 20s when you and Kat went to Aspen. 6 months after you arrive, you're the GM, she's the executive chef. Okay, so we've talked about floor manager. How about general manager? I mean, does that what is that?
So general manager does, generally everything. They should be the person that can fill any role and position in the front of the house. Host, server, bartender, right? So they have to kind of be a roundsman in that sense, but they're responsible for all of the hiring and firing, the training of the staff, any budget things, right? They have to watch the finances, labor numbers. In my position, you do promotion, social media, things of that nature. So you're kind of a little more running the business, but you also are overseeing service as well.
To get a promotion like that, so you go server, floor manager, general manager. At any time, did you ever think, I'm out ahead of my skis here? I'm a little anxious. This is a lot to ask of me. I mean, did you ever feel that way? Or did the owners of this establishment give you the sufficient training and support that was needed? I mean, that's a bit of a loaded question, but I
Yeah.
had to ask it.
No, there wasn't much of any training. I'm a big believer in you fake it till you make it. Um,
Okay.
the hospitality comes easy to me, right? I mean, for me, and that's why I say I felt like it was something that I was meant to do, because it's sort of my role in my family and amongst my friends to be the one to host the party, to make sure everyone is happy. That's sort of just in my nature. And so much of what I did, at least in the early days, was just that. And education and food is something that I'm passionate about. And the level of service, because I did have a fine dining server background, I was able to tap into that and sort of take the things that I had learned and just plant them into a management role. And I found really quickly that I was able to develop relationships with my hourly support staff to where they trusted my word, and we were able to work together as a team. So I've I've realized that I had some leadership skills that I hadn't otherwise needed to sort of flex because I hadn't been put in that position. But once I did, it felt very comfortable and natural.
You know, and that's so important because, I mean, we talked about this earlier in the show, is how many people kind of move through the restaurant industry or the hospitality eating industry, right? I'm a server, I'm a bartender, I'm a hostess. They do that for a while and then they head out. You have to establish not only rapport, but trust and confidence in those folks. And then, to your point, you have to manage them as a team, in spite of the fact that most of them, I suspect, with the exception of the folks that you mentioned, earlier that are career servers, most of them are viewing this as just a transitory experience. I mean, it's just like, hey, I'm here to make a few extra bucks. I'll do this for 6 months or a year, and then I'm out of here, right?
Well, and Aspen's incredibly transient. I mean, that place is like no other that I've ever run restaurants or worked in before, because it is a ski town, and people, they say they come for the winter, they stay for the summer, but it's nothing for people to come for one season and leave. So you're trying to create a culture of, to where you don't have a ton of attrition, but it's ultimately you're closing the restaurant in that seasonal capacity. You're closing the restaurant every 6 months for 2 months and then reopening with a new staff. So you have to, make your training as I guess efficient or functional as possible, because you're running through people on a pretty consistent basis. Fortunately, towards the end of our tenure, we were able to hire some amazing staff that stayed with us for a few years prior to us leaving.
Well, and I could say this only as an observation, because if people stayed with you that long, they certainly felt very comfortable with you and with Kat, the quality of food. We got away from the description of responsibilities about executive chef. So talk a little bit about what that meant for Kat as she was promoted into that role.
Well, Kat is incredibly systematic. I would say she is one of the best chefs, and I don't say that just because she's my spouse and she would kill me if I said otherwise, but she is incredibly organized and systematic, and that's something that makes, for me, I think, an amazing executive chef, because cost control is something that's huge. Labor control is something that's huge in restaurants. They always say the first thing that'll take down a restaurant is labor in the back of the house, because the hourly wage is so much higher. And she does a great job of managing that. So, but mostly you are creating a menu around a concept and costing out each individual item to make sure that that the restaurant is profitable, and then managing a team that is able to execute your views and expectations on a nightly basis, in addition to obviously changing the menu seasonally and trying to stay up with food trends.
Wow. So you did that for several years in Aspen beautiful place to live, but as you point out, highly transient in terms of the workforce and even the people. I mean, I suppose the folks that enjoy Aspen either come there as tourists or maybe they have a vacation home there or winter home, stay for a while and then leave. What was it like living in that kind of environment? Well, and actually, more appropriately to the show, what was it like running a restaurant there in a place like that?
It was wild. It was high energy Friday night, every night for 5 months. And it was so outrageously busy from about Memorial Day to Labor Day, and then you kind of die down, and then Christmas week hit, and then you're just going and going until, mid-March. So it was a wild time, and the most volume that I'd ever done before, but you get to learn really quickly on, for me, how to play what I call table Tetris, right? I mean, seats are their money. So every time somebody comes in, you don't say no. You cram as many people as you can in. You stretch your servers to the limit. You make sure that everybody has the tools to do their job, and you do your best to support them. And it was an amazing way for me to train myself and learn a skill set of how to manipulate reservations and tables, and to where we could maximize our occupancy every single night to where we could make the restaurant the most money.
So how do you, so I've always wondered this. Okay, so back in the land before time in Dallas, and it may still be there, there's a restaurant that rotates at the top of Reunion Tower. And when I got to be a certain age, I don't know how old I was, it finally dawned on me that the rotational speed of the restaurant was designed so that you would come in, you would order, you would be seated, you would order, and because everybody said, I want to go around one time, right? So that was the rotational speed of the restaurant, was the time they took to take your order, prepare your food, serve your food, all the way through drinks or whatever. And then once you got back to the place you started, most people would say, I've done my spin, right? So now I'm going to leave. And that was about 45 minutes, right? How do you manage people when they come into a restaurant, they sit down, how do you determine in advance sort of whether this is for them a celebratory moment where they're going to take their sweet time, or it's more functional? They just want to come in, have something to eat, and then leave, because that goes to the point of how do you maximize the use of your fixed costs, which are your tabletops, right?
Sure. So I think we have a baseline for what we know is an average time, right? Two people dine for about an hour and 45 minutes. 3 plus is 2 hours. 5 and more is 2.5 to 3 hours. And so we kind of start that as a baseline, and then we manage what we can on our end, right? So you sit down, you have a server that comes to your table within a minute, and then it's a back server, and then your front server comes over. So everything on our end is timed. We also time how long it takes for food to cook. So every dish has a time associated to it. So your appetizers take 8 to 10 minutes to get to the table. Entrees are 3 to 5 from a fire time. So everyone is responsible for timing your table to where you don't see it, right? You don't feel that impact, but we gauge it on our end. So we know, for the time that you've put your fork down and you're finished with your salads, the back server comes over, they remove it, the server's in the back firing your table. It's 3 to 4 minutes before your food comes out, and we're just keeping the flow going, but everything is timed specifically to where we can manage it. And then we pivot when somebody's dining a little bit longer than expected. In a restaurant that has 15 to 20 tables, you're going to have a little bit of variance. And so you monitor throughout. And so we have a computer that we use that every time somebody gets an appetizer or an entree, we mark that down. And so we're gauging, how long the table's taking in real time, so that we understand what we can put in and what we need to shuffle around.
So this time in Aspen was kind of like getting an MBA in running a high-end white tablecloth restaurant, right? So you got that. How did you go what's the journey from Aspen to Santa Fe? Because I know there's a couple of stops along the way. And it wasn't like somebody just handed you a check and said, hey, why don't you open a restaurant? I mean, it doesn't work that way, right?
I will tell you that we learned So we wanted to open our own restaurant. Once we finished with Steakhouse, I went on to work for a celebrity chef out of New York, David Burke. And that job I had for about 3.5 years that was a really big part of my MBA if we're talking about restaurants, because working with a corporate restaurant group like the Burke Group was such a learning experience for me. And I had some tremendous, people that I worked for that really believed in me and offered me an opportunity that I am forever I'm forever grateful for. It was such a wonderful experience. And I remember sitting at the rooftop of the Archer Hotel in downtown Manhattan, and I was talking to my boss, and we had maybe have a couple cocktails. And I said, Stephen, I want to own my own restaurant. Like I do, like I love working for you. But again, this like quiet ambition of like, there's something more, there's not enough, this is not enough, right? I'm at the peak of like corporate restaurant jobs and I'm not happy. And he just looked at me and he smiled and he goes, then go do it. You're going to be amazing. It's going to be great. Right. So I, I left the job. I resigned, and Kat and I started our journey of trying to find an investor or a bank that would loan us the money, which we quickly learned that the only people that loan you money for a restaurant are friends, family, and fools. And
Friends, family, fools. I have to remember that.
yep,
That's the three F's. Well, yeah, but you ended up moving from Colorado to New Mexico, correct? And running a food truck or something for a while?
yep. So we left Aspen with the idea that we were going to open our own restaurant, and we just needed to get somewhere that was a little bit more realistic for us. Aspen was outrageously expensive, and even more so at the time, or even more so now. And so we said, where do we want to go? And my wife's family is in the southern part of the state, and we knew we wanted to be close to her family. At the time, her father was very ill, and we wanted to be able to be a part of his healing process, or whatever, for as long as we could. And so we said, if we're going to live in New Mexico, where are we going to go? Well, we kind of took a little bit of a hiatus, and we ended up living on her family's farm and did some consulting for a restaurant in the southern part of the state. And after that consulting gig was over, we don't do well with being complacent, so we decided to buy ourselves a job, and we purchased a food truck and had that for about 4 months while we continued the journey of trying to find our brick and mortar.
So you're doing the food truck, and it's marvelous to hear that, because there are many people that I've met in my business career who would view that as a step backwards, right? They would say, oh my gosh, you've been running restaurants in Aspen and executive chef and GM, here you are doing a food truck and, nowhere, New Mexico, right? And yet you had a strategic plan, which was, we want to find our place for brick and mortar, and you needed to find, a backer, investors.
We need to find money.
Yeah. Oh God, do I know the money hunt? So yeah, that's challenging. So you clearly were successful ultimately in getting an investor or investors, correct? So how did you end up, getting comfortable with Santa Fe?
Well, one of the biggest things we learned in Aspen is if you're going to own a successful restaurant, you have to go where the money is. And Santa Fe, as far as, the state of New Mexico is concerned, it has the most money, it has the most affluence, right? It also, I said Dallas, kind of tiny but mighty culinary scene, but Santa Fe has a huge culinary footprint for the Southwest. And there were some restaurants here that, like Geronimo and the Compound and Coyote Cafe, that have been here for decades and have had a tremendous amount of success. And we also, having left Aspen, we really wanted to still continue to live that mountain lifestyle. We both are avid hikers. We love to go outside and to camp, and we wanted that. We craved that, and we didn't want to give that up. And so we knew we wanted to live in a town that would allow us to have that lifestyle. And Santa Fe is a town of 100,000 people, right? So it's small enough to where we have a real sense of community. We're not fighting traffic every day, right? Driving on the highways. We can walk to work if we want. And so we have that sense of the lifestyle that we wanted to live. And also, be in a place where there is money in order. I mean, we wanted to open a high-end steakhouse. Kat has a ranching background, as you mentioned. Before she became a chef, she was a rancher. So we wanted to tap into that. And at the time, Santa Fe didn't really have a chef-driven steakhouse, and so we knew that we could really make a mark and be a real competitor if we were able to secure a space in town.
So that's key. And there's really two things you've said. One is you did an assessment of the competitive. Well, first of all, you said, and I love this answer, you got to go where the money is. I mean, I listen to people who are younger and I hear folks say, follow your passion, follow your passion, follow your passion. And I get that. You also need, if you would like to get paid, you need to go where there's money and a market, right? So that was kind of an important criteria. Secondly, though, you had to find the retail space. Oh, I say retail space, it's a location, right, for the restaurant. But thirdly, you did that sort of competitive analysis because you're right, there are a lot of quality restaurants in Santa Fe. And I mean, I got to tell you, to say I'm going to open a restaurant in that city that, again, to the point you made earlier, has a big culinary footprint. How did you, I mean, I understand about Kat's background, growing up on a ranch and being super skilled when it comes to, all things beef, right? But that's one of those things we tend to do in business is we take our strengths and we tend to project them into the market. We go, well, I'm really good at this, therefore I think people need it. What sort of assessment did you do that said just what you just said? We think there's a niche that we can carve out for a chef-driven steakhouse in Santa Fe. How did you go about that process?
Well, we did a little R&D, so we did some research and went to the various restaurants, and we realized a few things. Santa Fe is really old school. All the chefs a lot of the chefs had been here for a really long time. They were deeply rooted. Weren't a lot of female chefs, so we knew that we could kind of hit the mark on that. And secondly, the service we found was very cold. There wasn't a lot of sincerity in their approach, and the servers were very systematic, but they didn't seem very happy. And so we knew we had an opportunity to sort of couple with the two to say, my style of hospitality, what I believe to be what's the most important to me is to create a culture where people are genuine and happy and gracious. And once you get to a certain threshold in a restaurant, these sort of upper echelons, you walk in and they make you feel like you're lucky to be there as opposed to the other way around. And I hate that, right? I want people to walk in and feel like we're excited that you are going to come to our restaurant and spend your hard-earned money, and we're grateful for that, and treat you with a sense of respect and graciousness and gratitude. And that's something that we hadn't really experienced in all of these restaurants. They were good, but they just kind of lacked that little piece, and so we felt really comfortable and confident that we could deliver something that sort of personal attention and personal touch from a hands-on executive chef, right? Not one that had been in the restaurant for decades, but one that was hungry and ready to really fight for their place in this town. And we were able to find a spot that allowed us the opportunity to do that.
What's interesting to me, and I've experienced this in my own business career, but listening to you, there's a wonderful echo here. Employees, people in an organization tend to reflect the ethos that the management team, the ownership group create. They also tend to respond sort of emotionally to how they're treated, right? So if you treat people with respect, if you treat them with, as you point out, an attitude of, gratitude, doesn't mean you don't have high expectations for their performance, but joyfulness, positivity, we're glad you're on the team. And that tends to flow out, I would think, to your clients, right? So when people walk in to the restaurant, they can kind of feel we're funny as people. We can sense that stuff, right? we can sense when somebody is happy as a server or as a hostess or as, bussing tables. You can feel that. I mean, which I think is your point, is that when you did that competitive assessment there, things, the other restaurants seemed, your phrase was cold. I would almost say mechanical. I mean, people are doing their job. It's good food. It's a beautiful venue, but there's
There's,
something more to eating than that, right?
there's no soul.
Right.
And that, I mean, we look, we have failed. It's not always a perfect model, but we try to provide our employees with a sense of ownership, because the truth is, one of the things I think makes us different is, from a restaurant culture standpoint, the front of the house and the back of the house typically, historically, are at odds, right? You've got a chef cussing the server and, you should sell my food, and I can't believe they rang this ticket in wrong, and the chef's a jerk, and they're at odds. And for us, it's so important to have the synergy between the two and realize that you our belief is that you cannot have success without the other. And so we do everything that we can to make sure that we are monitoring the culture of the restaurant, is probably the biggest part of my job. And even the smallest thing can kind of tip it to the edge to make sure that people feel appreciated and are respected, and that they know that they have a voice, because what they say matters, right? I'm not on the front line all the time. And so they need to know that they're heard and that their voice is valued. And that's been kind of a secret to a part of our success, especially since we've had such minimal turnover, which has been pretty amazing.
So again, for people who are listening to this, I haven't asked you, like in a business case, you would go, okay, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. But when did you start MarketSteer and then intersect that with the pandemic? Right? Because if I recall properly, you guys opened that place and not too long thereafter, the world shut down.
Yep. So we opened in August of 2018. Thankfully for us, for the pandemic, we had just enough under our belt to kind of sustain us. What we didn't know at the time was that our time in the food truck really worked to our advantage, because we were able to quickly pivot once we had to, let go of all of our employees. And Kat and I are able to, work the line together. So I'm not a chef by any means. I would never claim to be, but I am a pretty skilled line cook. And so we kind of pivoted and changed our menu to more of that grab and go curbside style for a few months. But then we quickly realized that, as much as that was, it was a good place for us to start, people really didn't want to buy a $65 steak in a box. So, and it didn't really make sense for us at the time to try to stay with that same high end steakhouse model. So we closed. And then, New Mexico, for the rest of the world, we were one of those states that it was sort of like open, close for about 18 months. And fortunately, we had a really large patio. So when we did have to reduce down to 50% and then 25%, there was enough seats for us to still maintain. And look, we were fortunate. At the time, we were in a hotel, and the hotel group was going through the same thing that we were. And so we were able to negotiate with them an opportunity for us to sort of stay open and with minimal impact to our business while still serving their guests. And so it ended up being a very mutually beneficial relationship.
You were because you use the past tense here about the location, and I understand that you guys are headed elsewhere. So tell us a little bit about that, because that's a whole nother chapter here, right? I mean, in my head, I'm thinking, okay, so food truck, brick and mortar, and now what's happening?
So we were in the hotel. So let's see, we opened in August of 18, the pandemic hit. And let me tell you, 2021, for those people who love to go out to dinner, they came out with a vengeance. And we were busier than we had ever been. And that continued for the next 2 years. And so fortunately for us, restaurants are incredibly expensive to open. And for our first restaurant, this one, we were able to land a spot that was essentially turnkey, right? It had equipment, it had silverware. And so for a minimal investment, which was ideal, we were able to come in and really tell our story through food and not have to worry about building out a location. And so we paid off our initial debt within the first 2.5 years, and we're in the process of just making money. And so it was about 5 years in, we said, what are we going to do? Our relationship with the hotel had kind of come to an end. We had a unique arrangement, and we were limited with how we could expand our operation. And so we started looking around and ultimately ended up buying a commercial building on the other side of downtown Santa Fe, and are currently under renovations and are set to open within the next month.
Wow. It's interesting because as I listen to you describe the competitive advantage of your restaurant, and, I just realized we've gone through this whole episode and never told anybody the name of your place. It's Market Steer Steakhouse. I'll make sure it's in the show notes. I mean, we've been talking this whole time and we've never said, hey, what's the name of your place in Santa Fe? So it's Market Steer Steakhouse. So you've talked about your competitive advantage being a couple of things. One, it's a your executive chef is somebody who's very much hands-on involved, has a passion, grew up on a ranch, loves steak, et cetera. So that's one piece. And the other one is what you call soul, right? It's that whole service that you deliver. Now you have an opportunity through the remodeling of this new venue to put your own, if you will, your own fingerprints on the interior of this building. What has that process been like?
It is the biggest challenge I think either one of us had ever endured, and far more so than we had imagined. Well, first and foremost, so we're excited to be able to tell our story, as I said, through design and not just food. And that's been a tremendous amount of fun, because I think in the beginning when we had an idea of what we wanted it to look like, and now it's sort of morphed into its own thing. So it's somewhat personal, but also we want it to, seem like it fits in Santa Fe and with our concept, which we're really thrilled to showcase that to people. But the city of Santa Fe is different. It's the oldest capital in the nation. We are in a historic district, and I'll tell you, a few weeks ago this is probably the most interesting one so far. We were forced to put in a sprinkler system in our building, and so we were tapping into the city's water main. They had to dig up the street, and as we were going through this process, someone from the Historic Society came over, and it was their inspector, and he got in the dirt, which was, it was a hole about 8 feet deep, and he started poking around and started finding what looked like pottery to me, and they ended up being bones. So he calls in the city's archaeologist. The city's archaeologist comes over, and they stop the entire process. So all the workers have to get out of the hole. We have to shut down the whole operation because they think that they're human remains. And so we're looking at this guy and we're like, you got to be kidding me. And he said, ma'am, if they're human remains, we have to pay them respect. And we're like, with all due respect, you built a road over the remains already. So they're out there with their rulers and their little brushes, and, they finally get the state's archaeologist to come out and say, it's raccoon bones, it's not human remains, we're fine. But things like that happen all the time in Santa Fe, and builds get red tagged, and you have to stop until you sort of pay homage and respect to whatever is buried. And it can be challenging, and small town historical city, they certainly don't make it easy, and we've had our fair share of struggle.
But having said that, you're going to open in a month.
Well, from your lips to God's ears. That's what we keep hoping.
Yeah, right. Well, okay. So as you think back on your career, now let's go all the way back to when you started as a hostess at Chili's, right? And you move forward. What are some of the top positive takeaways that you have about this journey that you've been on? What are some of the things that jump to your mind as being, these are some of the lessons that I've learned. These are some of the positive things. What would those be?
Well, I have to say, first and foremost, it's the relationships that I've maintained through my career. I have been fortunate enough to have some amazing mentors and people along the way that were willing to answer questions and give me good advice and provide me with some insight. I I would say that's probably my greatest achievement are those continued relationships, because I wouldn't be the person that I am today without their guidance. And yeah, and I would say that just learning to be patient and trust the process and learn how to be a leader and not a boss. That was something that I wish I would have learned a little bit early on. Whereas now I feel like I can lean into that a little bit more and show people what I want done as opposed to just being a dictator.
Would there be more people in management that understood the difference between being a boss and a leader? It's huge. It's really different. And it's wonderful that you've learned that. One observation I want to make as I listen to you, and this again goes back to your experience at the beginning of your career at Chili's and at Houston's. You talk about process, and you also did that at Aspen, and I assume you also learned that when you were working with the Burke Group, right? There's a book that was published, I think, first in the 1980s called The E-Myth. And that's capital E myth, M-Y-T-H. And the premise of the book is that being a successful entrepreneur is reducing everything that you possibly can to a procedure that you can then train other people how to do. Because and the reason he used the title E-Myth is because there's this notion that to be a successful entrepreneur, you have to be born that way, or, it's somehow this sort of magical, ethereal thing. And the author of this book said, no, it's really process. And if you can master that process and then communicate that, and now, as you've described in your role as a, co-owner of this business and the general manager managing the front of the house, if you can reduce all that process to procedures that you then, show people through leadership, this is what I want done, God, you will be so successful. And you are.
I would say the hardest piece, the hardest secondary piece to that is getting people that are kind and that care about making people happy. That's the part of the hospitality business that I think sometimes gets missed. You can teach people the systems all day long, but if they don't have the heart behind it, they're never going to succeed.
That's the soul. That's the soul part. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time and taking us through your journey. For those people who haven't figured this out by now, you are my oldest daughter, and I am super proud of you. So thanks so much for being on the show and for making your dad proud.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm Mark Good. You've been listening to my remarkable podcast. For more episodes like this, as well as premium content, visit my site, markgood.substack.com.
Humble.